Cosmina is a graduate fellow here at YIISA. She's engaged in doing a PhD in the history department at
Where?
Bolivia University in Romania. She's writing her dissertation on anti-Semitism in the Romanian collective imaginary in the 20th century. Cosmina's research it deals with issues of oral histories and interviews, sociological inquiries, and classical history analysis, which is centered on issues of anti-Semitism, collective memory, and Jewish heritage in the Romanian context. She received her first degree, her BA in sociology, and her master's in Jewish studies at University. And she's also working as a researcher at the Institute of Oral History in Cluj-Napoca, in Romania. And I should say her work on the history is very important. She has sort of uncovered historical facts about killings in Romania after the Holocaust officially ended, and that was groundbreaking. And now she's moving to a slightly different topic today.
Yeah, they present this topic. It is about the present paper. I discuss some aspects of the campus anti-Zionism, trying to understand how this phenomenon overlaps anti-Semitism and how it should be addressed. If it is a very present phenomenon and as a transnational one, like, or maybe it's just a vocal or therefore a marginal phenomenon. So I will discuss both these aspects and the layers to show that it is a very symptomatic. I would like first to start discussing about this phenomenon as very present at the level of European campus, but I will also make a parallel with what is going on at the level of in the United States and why it is a very different issue. But what I would like to start about is about the Holocaust denial within the New Left. And with respect to this issue of Holocaust understanding within the New Left, I would like to discuss how this resonates with the understanding of Holocaust in the Soviet Union. I strongly believe that this phenomenon is underemphasized, and it is very relevant to show the parallels in thinking and in the totalitarian nature. And why it is so important to this parallel to be stressed. I do think that this understanding is an important layer for assessing the present campus anti-Israeli attitudes. First, I will talk about some aspects of the Soviet historiography. Except for the very first post-war years, Soviet historiography tried to both nationalize and internationalize the Holocaust. Nationalization aimed at transforming Jewish victims into local national victims, while internationalization was meant to emphasize that everyone could become a victim to the Nazi regime, and therefore that all people were subjected to the Nazi murder. In the first case, for example, with respect to the nationalization of the victim at Majdanek, at Auschwitz, at Treblinka, on the monument, it was written that Polish citizen dies, and also others. And that was the case also for other countries, such as Romania or Czechoslovakia. For example, in the case of Czechoslovakia, the history textbooks, it was written that Auschwitz was created to accommodate Democrats from all over the continent. So this, it is a kind of misappropriation of the Holocaust, and that this Jewish suffering is going into forgotten. And this internationalization of the victim is equally a relevant phenomenon. This kind of struggle to try to argue that Holocaust has nothing to do with Jewishness, that everyone could be deported, even today in the educational material of the Holocaust, there is this idea that there is a large spread of this attitude that the Jews are deported, and not the Jews are deported, but everyone can be deported, as the Catholics tomorrow and the day after tomorrow anyone. So everyone might become a victim, and therefore all the Soviet nations were victims of the Nazis. So we may note here that the figure of the perpetrator is very clear. We still have to bear in mind that there is the Nazi figure of the perpetrator par excellence, but the victim is diluted. everyone can be, and this Jewish suffering is misappropriated to all the other nations, to the Poles, to the Romanians, to the Russian. Everyone could, it is a subject to the Nazi murder, to the perpetrator. So the understanding of Holocaust totally failed. As the understanding of Holocaust being directed against the Jews or having something to do with the Jewishness. However, we may note today the same tendency, not today, but starting in the 1970s, this is more important to assess this subject, in the New Left thinking, which is present since 1970s and 1980s. It depends if also if we stress more what is going on in Paris or what is going on in Germany. But I would say that it has always been present, but since 1980s became more vocal. That with respect to Holocaust, we should not stress Jewish matters. And it is arguing also against the uniqueness of the Holocaust and its Judeo-centric character. These are very frequent arguments towards the same misappropriation of the Holocaust at the level of the New Left. In the case of, for example, in the case of the Klaus Barbie trial in France, much of the discussion was carried from the perspective of how should one today understand Holocaust, and there were many voices against this Judeo-centric character of the Holocaust. There is the same internationalization of the victim, and talking about the Holocaust as just a genocide, and that Holocaust is not so important to be addressed as a subject, because what is going on in Rwanda or Darfur, there are genocide and they are more important, and there is nothing about unique or special to talk about Holocaust. And the same idea that everyone can become a victim, and we do not have to stress the Jewish matters. So it comes to be seen as as an European phenomenon with no larger relevance than a local one, to be circumscribed to these European matters, and that now we should think more globally. It came to be, it was seen like world face now new challenges, and the relevance of Holocaust is too limited and too local. On the other hand, Holocaust was merely seen as a genocide, one of many others. Somehow related to this issue, Henri Rousseau, who is a French historian, and he wrote very important books on the syndrome Vichy and the way that France came to terms with their past and in the Second World War, and other relevant books about what happened with the Jews during the Second World War and after, in its aftermath. He is invited to this Klaus Barbie trial, and he refused to go because his testimony as a historian would be just one of the many others. So it is this relativization that when you are coming to the process of a Nazi collaborator, and you can show that it was a persecution against the Jews, your opinion is one through the others. So he declined this invitation. So I would show that now, at the level of the New Left, Holocaust is very much relativized, and also its victims, and as it is considered a genocide between many others. So I would show that at the level of the New Left, strongly resonates with what was going on in the Soviet Union, with keeping the image of the Nazi very strong and internationalizing the victim, or what was called before the Jewish suffering. Therefore, the Palestinians became the victims, and the Jews became now the Nazis. There is also this misappropriation can be traced back in the level of the New Left in 1968 when Finkelkraut was noted. That in the May 1968 movement in France, the students were chanting. They began to chant, "We are all German Jews." Yet, I'm quoting, "Yet for all the sincerity the demonstrators possessed, their indignation tells only half the story. The improvised march was also a festival. Jewish identity was no longer for Jews alone. The event taking place put an end to such exclusivity. Every child of the post-war era could change places with the outsider and wear a yellow star. The role of the just now belonged to whoever wished to assume it. The crowd felt justified in proclaiming its own exceptional status, which largely explains the exuberant cheer of its members. So again, we are I want to stress this misappropriation of the Holocaust and the identifying with the victim, which was also going on at the level in the Soviet Union, just in the next years after so before 1968 was already going on in the Soviet Union that the Soviets and each country under the Soviet control were trying to appropriate this Jewish suffering and to say that going to forget everything that has to do with the Jewishness. Symptomatic it is the case of the anti-fascist Jewish committee in the Soviet period, which was documenting the Holocaust largely, and they're supposed to publish the Black Book of Holocaust just in the aftermath of the Second World War. But Soviet figured out very easy in 1946 that there is no point to stress Jewish suffering, and they could not appropriate anymore the suffering, and the book appeared only in the United States with the documents on the Holocaust and on the Jewish suffering, and therefore the president of the committee, Solomon Miklos, was killed. And anything that has to be as a Jewish committee or anti-fascist has to do with the Jewishness was forbidden in the United Union Soviet, and they appropriated the status of victim, like the working party, the working class. We were the ones who were the victims, and all the Jewish concentration camps and extermination camps were camps for the Democrats. So I would say that this tracing back what is going on now, what's starting to going on at the level of New Left, tracing it back in the Soviet Union, it would be very revealing to understand this ideology, and that there is a very important layer in the discourse of anti-Israel discourse that is going on now at the New Left campuses. And this is also a very present phenomenon, and it is a transnational one. So if we want to assess this phenomenon, it would be no point to look to what is going on at the at the University of California at Irvine, or to look at what is going on the level of the Paris campuses, because this is the framework for the general understanding that it goes more like a transnational understanding. This transnational kind of movement, I would like to make a parallel here, or to give you an insight into how to understand this transnational. It was a theater play written in 1959 by Eugen Ionesco, and entitled "The Rhinoceros." The author imagined an absurdist scenario where people from a French little town, one by one, transformed themselves into rhinoceros. The physical metamorphose, the rhinocerization, is a metaphor for a moral change of the subject as a result of ideological contamination. The play has its origin in the author's experience as a student college in Bucharest in the 1930s, when he had witnessed how his friends, one by one, were starting to see in the Jew the roots of the evil, and how one by one were turning into anti-Semites. Now we can witness the same mass ideology, or the same ideological contamination at the level of campuses, when everyone is becoming an anti-Israeli. And so there is this parallel with the mass metamorphosis of the interwar students movement that might be drawn today on the European campus at large. And what helps to figure out what this European campus means? It's like an imaginary place, which is very present starting with 2000, when European Union decided after the Lisbon Treaty that there should be much more, in order to create a European identity, you should increase the mobility of the students at the level of higher university. So we have this phenomenon of at the level of campuses, because only at the university level you have this movement of changes, and in this way the dissemination of these new left ideas is very easy to be done. And there is there is another phenomenon that I would say that it is a very marginal one, and even though it is more vocal, it is what is going on when anti-Zionism overlaps anti-Zionism, and we can, it is unambiguous. It is, I talk about the destruction of a Holocaust memorial display or the graffiti depicting swastika that you could meet on the Paris campuses, or it happened also in Romania, or the same case of the University of California at Irvine. And also a case in point is also the Middle East departments, when the boycotts against the Israeli students are very loud. And of course, you also talk about another particularities at the level of the Great Britain. And with respect to this, they are more marginal and but very vocal, and also at the Berkeley. But I would say that I would say that they fail the understanding of assessing this phenomenon because they are so vocal and they are so appropriated by neo-Nazi groups or by the Islamist groups, and it is under the legitimation of the idea that the critic of Israel is a legitimate position. So when ADL or other institutions of monitoring anti-Semitism in Europe or in the United States try to monitor this phenomenon, so they go only when this discourse against Jews are turning into effective assaults that can be documented, that can be numbered, and can be proved. So because of this, I would say not to have so much fascination with the data given by the ADL, or which are numbers, and like any numbers who document the violence, they underestimate the violence, because the violence has to be reported. You need to have an education in order to report the fact as being violent against you as a Jew. So the fluctuations are not so important. But if we look to the numbers in generally speaking, we can note that also at the level of European campuses, and also in the United States, and it is so much talked about now, the Canada case, it is an increase since the second Intifada. It is an increase in the violence against the Jews as the Jews, because many times they are looked at like Israeli soldiers, those who are Israeli soldiers. So one more point I would like to make with respect to this new left anti-Semitism, that we can see this ambivalent attitudes towards the Jews. That like in the Soviet, like in the Soviet ideology, there is the good Jew and the bad Jew. So the good Jew means the one who is not stressing his Jewishness, and who get rid of his Jewishness or go against his Jewishness, and the one who is like the others. That started under Stalin and continued during the whole Soviet Soviet period, and after that. And the same thing is going on now to the level of the new left, that the good Jew is the one who is against Israel, who is thinking like us, and the bad Jew is the Israeli one. And I think that there is much literature, and many people talked here about this apartheid and anti-apartheid movement, and at the level of the connection between the Nazi and Israeli and all this. I will not stress this, but I just want to mention that all this language we already have in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union started to represent the Israeli as being an apartheid movement, the apartheid state, that being a colonial power and being an imperialist. So all this language we have to trace back to the Soviet Union, and after that to note the danger and what this kind of ideology can mean. Thank you.
Thank you. So first question, how would you trace the link that the new left has ideologically, if you will, to the Soviet Union? What's the linkage, and how does this spread into Western European kind of or political context?
So you see that there is the same kind of misappropriation, the way you see the victim and the way you see, for example, in the Holocaust, which is so symptomatic for the understanding, you see there is the same kind of language and the same kind of misappropriation of the Holocaust. You have the Nazi figure, and everyone like they seem to be like, we learned the lesson, yeah, the Nazis are the perpetrator, but the victim can become anyone. It's not a matter of being Jew or not. So this is like a trying to.
Is it 1960? Is it the War of '67? What changes in Western Europe? Why does the Soviet anti-Semitism or Soviet ideological influence enter into Western Europe?
I think it is, generally speaking, there is a left thinking, and it would be hard to prove that first it was in Soviet and after that it was in the new left, but it was, for sure there are migrations between these.
You speak about the link, so I'm wondering,
You
have to prove the link. How do you prove the link? Because you mentioned that there is a link between the new left and the Soviet Union's anti-Semitism.
Because, for example, in all the monuments at Auschwitz or monuments of the concentration and extermination camps, and in the historiography of the Soviet, they are saying that they're not saying that the Jews were killed, but they are saying that the Poles were killed, or the Russians were killed, or the Democrats were killed. So they are saying that they say nothing about the Jews. And the same it is when, this is what I try to show with Finkelkraut Code, that when the students start chanting in May 1968, we are all German Jews, it is the same kind of misappropriation. You are not the Jew. It is, because, again, the Nazi perpetrator is a very strong figure, but the victim identity is that anyone can become. And this is very important to understand that not everyone can be, anti-Semitism is not like all the other, it's not just.
So 68 a watershed, the 68 does something happen in Western European societies and universities or in the intellectual community?
Yes.
Are you trying to point to something that?
In the late of 1960s, it is a time when the works of the Jewish survivors are published, and the Europe became more aware by what meant the Holocaust period. Because at the beginning they are very concerned with having a good face and showing that they were resistant to Nazi, for example, in France and all over the Western Europe. They try to stress their national pride, that they were fighting against the evil. And after that, in 1960s, they became more sensitive to the Jewish suffering. And parallel with this, I would say there is also this kind of misappropriation, because they became indeed such. It is not like a bad intention, because they became so aware by the Jewish suffering, they feel like they more empathize with the victim, or identify themselves with the victim, or they are more likely to identify themselves like the victim. But the other side of the effect is that they don't want to talk about the Jewishness anymore, because they try to talk only about the victimhood. And you have to address the Holocaust issue like being very Jewish, about the Jewish suffering, and it was about the Jewish suffering. It was not about the Democrats, it was not about the good people, it was about the Jewishness.
And just a final point before Michelle. If you're looking at anti-Semitism on university campuses in Western Europe and Northern United States, there's actually excellent empirical research and reports that are being done that measure it and look at it and document it. So I think you should include it, obviously, in your study. And of course, I'll quote my old article but the thing I did with Edward Kaplan on looking at what we called Israel bashing and classical anti-Semitism. Actually, we did 5,000 interviews in 10 European countries, so these things are measured. So, and also we know what is anti-Semitism and what is anti-Zionism, and when does critiques of Israel become, we call it Israel bashing or reformed hatred. So these things have to really be defined clearly.
Yeah.
Because not all criticism, of course, of Israel is anti-Semitic.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
In your groups, you haven't mentioned the Gypsies, the several million Gypsies, just playing devil's advocate the other way. And in your country, Romania, how many, 2 million Gypsies were Holocaust? At least 2 or 3 million gypsies?
No, no.
Well, I've read several figures. I've read as high as 3 million. I've
Yes,
read-
and along with the gypsies, there were also people with handicaps, and
Yeah.
there were the gays, the
But
homosexuals, but it was not I would still emphasize on the fact that the Jewish extermination was very defining for understanding Holocaust. It's not so much that anyone could become.
I think it's a challenge, your thing. I still don't see, and just be a personal feeling, I still don't see that linkage why that became so rapid, that change. The
Michelle?
linkage, I still don't see the linkage.
Michelle?
I mean,
Michelle?
just superficially, but I mean, profound, it's a profound thing. What are you getting? I'm kind of a leftist, and I don't know why my fellow leftists have gone this route, because I haven't, and I have no feeling for it, so it's just sort of a personal thing.
They all became rhinoceros.
Yeah. What's the sociological, historical, psychoanalytic, what happened, or what's happening?
Michelle?
You seem to be suggesting that there are no other victims in history that are, I mean, I don't want to say equal, but that we can use the concept of genocide to describe. And I just want to point out, right, to be careful, because I think obviously this is a major debate among historians about what Cambodia was, and I think there's an emergent consensus that Cambodia, yes, it was a genocide. So these are very big and small debates.
No.
so-
I'm not talking. I was not against the genocide. I was talking about Holocaust like just a genocide to many others, and not so important. And there is something very specific about Holocaust. And
Right, okay.
yeah, so it is not just one genocide through the other. So we don't have to stress its importance, or we don't have to talk about it. It is
Yeah.
something.
But I think identifying this still remains a very contentious area of philosophical and historical debate. I mean, because we don't have, coming up with typology of genocide, would be a useful endeavor, because, I'm not sure that anyone has offered any precise definition yet of what makes the Jewish genocide then different from Cambodia genocide. I mean, I think there are ideas, philosophical ideas, but it's a complicated issue. It's not.
Yeah.
And maybe you have some thoughts on it.
I would say that what it is so specific. So first of all, this I want to say that because of the visitor actions, this trying to put it in the law, you make it like being a genocide and like creating a precedent, and it can happen again. But when you are stressing from a moral point of view, or from another point of view, I would say that what is so specific about the Holocaust, it is the scale that happened, the fact that all the Europeans were so civilized at that point, that nobody did anything about it. Everyone was acknowledged what is going on. So nobody was not even throwing a bomb to explode a railway trace, So this was that everyone was so silent, and the scale of the genocide, the Holocaust,
Well, same thing in Cambodia. Everybody was pretty much silent.
yeah, but it was it was at the European scale, and here you prove that also the Catholicism, all the Jews the church failed, in fact, because all the Jews who were converted were not recognized a conversion. So every single person failed at the level of Europe. It is not a matter of country inside the country, because at this point, for example, also you can talk about the Romania, that so many millions of people were killed in the communist period, but it was not the Holocaust.
And of course, the difference is in the ideology, if I may add that, that you see that you have the idea of a world conspiracy, and in the anti-Semitic ideology, you have this idea of a world conspiracy of that, and so this leads to the reaction that that, for example, in the Nazi time, the Nazis were trying to started a war against many countries because of their anti-Semitic beliefs, and so I think there's a major difference to other ideologies.
I mean, I just suggest that this is a complicated and there's a very large historical debate over each of these.
Yeah.
I think it's simple. No.
I would suggest that 1968 became the watershed year because of the war in 1967, where the Jews for 2,000 years had been victims. Now, in 6 days, they no longer were the victims. What right do they have to be the victims? I mean, even the Jews themselves love to be thought of as victims. But here it was, they no longer had to have the sympathy of other nations. Now, with great publicity and what have you, with the Arabs keeping those refugees in camps for now over 60 years and using them as pawns in their game against Israel, they've managed to attract the left. Whereas previously, we had them until we had the nerve, who were we to become victims?
Thank you.
I would say that also to this understanding contributed a lot to the fact that also in the Soviet space it was understood that the Nazi collaboration with the Zionists, and this collaboration, that the language is the same now that you meet as
On the question of why there was a turning point in the 60s, maybe because of what you said, but I think another reason for the turning point is that the victims, the survivors of the Holocaust, were silent for quite a few decades after the war. And then after the Eichmann trial, they began to speak up. And that was a big change. The second point I wanted to make is following up what you said. I think one has to distinguish between the globalization, what you mentioned, internationalization of the Holocaust, which was used in Eastern Europe and also in Germany to emphasize a lot of people were killed and so on, not just Jews. And some of the monuments for the Holocaust were often not identified with Jews at all, just general. But that's different from the globalization of genocide, which is your point. And I agree with the point that I don't believe that the Holocaust is so unique. You have Rwanda, you have Cambodia, you have others. And Ben Kiernan here, I don't know if you're in touch with him, at Yale, who's trying to do a typology of genocides. I don't think we should claim that the Holocaust is a unique genocide. It's one of several.
yeah. I wanted to say something about.
I mean, there are two different kinds of globalization.
Yeah.
One is legitimate and one is not.
Yeah, about your first point that the Jews started talking about Holocaust only after the Eichmann trial. No, they started to talk before. Also, Primo Levi published in the early 50s his books, but nobody was paying attention to him because nobody was prepared to listen to the Jewish suffering, because everyone was thinking that no, we are those who stood here and who carried the war. We were those who were resistant to Nazi. So you are constructing a myth of, it was constructed a myth of resistance, of the national resistance, and no one wants to listen about the Jews who were so just victims. So people didn't listen to them, and only after that they became aware. There were biographies.
And I think just to follow up on what you said though too, I wrote a paper on the biotic people. These are the people of Newfoundland, which is an interesting name of a place, Newfoundland. They were indigenous people when the British came, and the last one died in 1829. Her name was Sawantowit, and she died of old age. The last one. The British completely annihilated the entire indigenous people of Newfoundland. And to this day, young children in Newfoundland, St. John's, Newfoundland, go to a museum where the British kept immaculate records and put skeletons and artifacts on display, and the kids go and they see this. And it's not dissimilar to some of the museums that were being created in Nazi Germany. There was a history of this type of assembling of records and putting people on display and all that sort of thing. So I think there are similarities. There's uniqueness and difference, but there's also similarities. And I have one question to you. You said that you were speaking about how the church failed and all this sort of building railroad tracks, that sort of thing. And you said Europe failed. And my question is, failed at what?
So they had this very beautiful project of Jewish emancipation and getting out of rational and enlightenment and everything. And Holocaust was the point that everyone felt. It is not, I would say, not only Germany, but Germany, of course, par excellence, because they put, but all the status apparatus of every state, they were engaged with this. So I would say that the scale and the process is not just something about national. It is Europe.
Enlightenment failed? Is this what you're saying? Or no? Europe died in Auschwitz? No.
It was also a discussion when how can we write poetry after Auschwitz, and it is written this, but of course I would say that it was a very big failure. Yes, this and this Zionist dream has much to do with European failure, constant failure, because also before it was the good Jew and the bad Jew, and resentment to their emancipation and to the rights. So I would just not say that it is a marginal phenomenon. And yeah, we were taking them out of it. The Europeans were taking them out of ghettos, and they felt this.
I just want to say that the difference between the Holocaust and any other genocide is that those genocides were within one country, but one people, a government against its people, or one group against the other. Whereas this was a group of nations against one population. So it was a much broader, in that sense, it was a much broader support for the
How about
genocide.
the colonization of Africa and enslavement? Slavery trade? That was many
No,
European
it's not.
countries engaged in.
But it was slave and not
It was
necessarily,
systematic extermination.
it wasn't an extermination.
There's definitely systematic extermination of people. Actually, a great paper that was given here by Kernan's seminar was a young scholar, I forget his name, who he finished his PhD, was looking at Namibia, in which the Germans exterminated 1 million Namibians, and the soldiers that exterminated the Namibian people went on to play very key roles in the rise of the Nazi Party and the SS and the army. So there, I mean, there's one example of training in Africa that contributed to the Shoah.
Which were the other countries besides Germany that wanted to exterminate the Jews? Some collaborated, Poles, French,
Hungarians.
but they didn't really.
Well, but they all
policy.
participated, nobody,
They collaborated.
they collaborated. I mean, some of them were actually allies and others just did nothing, which was just the same.
It is now, this definition of Holocaust, now it is challenged. There is a project led by the professor here at Yale, Timothy Snyder, and there is also inquiries led by Chris Dubois in France, but on Ukrainian, and they show that in fact our understanding of Holocaust in the classical form, it is that of this camp of extermination. But in fact, there were only a few millions who died. On all the Soviet soil, you have in fact many mass murders which are not documented yet. And because now, after 1990, the documents are open to the public, you can in fact trace that another Holocaust in fact was taking place. And all of this idea that the Germans, with the Germans, the others just collaborate or said nothing, or it is like a myth, because it was a bad conscience and the countries were not forced to come to terms with their past. It was something very comfortable, now we are the winners. But now, when you document this, you see that almost in their courtyard, it is in their backyard, there is another mass grave. Because they, like it is a case of Jedwabne in Poland, when the neighbors turned against the neighbors and thousands of Jews were killed. We also have the case in Romania. I documented the Jewish mass grave after the war, but there is Radu Ionida, the Holocaust Memorial Museum at Washington, who is trying to uncover a Jewish mass grave of thousands of people, but because of the political pressure, it is not left because it is this deflection of Holocaust. No, Holocaust took place at all. This is the imaginary, the comfortable version, and not all over the.
So we have to go, but I just want to, because we have to leave the room actually 15 minutes ago. I just want to say on a final note that was really, thank you for all your papers. It was a pleasure that you were here this year. And one final word of wisdom, you know, all of your, I think your work, it's not easy work, and I wish you success and perseverance, because I'm sure you'll all become you know, promising futures in the academy, and keep at it. It's very important what you're all doing. So,